that's really important to articulate, the idea that there is different ideas of value that are playing out here, right? And I think that's what one needs to bring to center stage at some time in terms of contestation of ideas. So conservation, actually, if you step back and look at it, is fraught with these contestations. Infinite growth on a finite planet is either the dreams of a madman or an economist.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the third episode of Conservation in the Middle. We're looking at knowledge, power, and the role of the economy, and having conversations about issues that trouble us about conservation. So in this episode, which is the third one, we're going to tackle the issue of sustainable development. I think I'll start with a story that I don't know if any of you have heard. 2002, I was visiting a very famous protected area in North Bengal, and talking to the forester in charge of the park. And he told me, we have a lot of eco-development committees. We now need to work with sustainable development. There are local communities who live here. They're very poor. We need to help them. And this is a park, like we were discussing in some of the other episodes, where the British colonialists at that time had taken a lot of the wetlands, which have the high biodiversity, and put teak on them. So one of the things the forest department was doing every year was to cut the teak and remove it. So he said, the eco-development committees, now we've got them involved heavily in this. So I said, okay, what are you doing there? He said, we have these committees that we form, and before they used to be only, we used to do all the teak cutting ourselves. I said, why don't you uproot the teak? No, they have to have labor. We have to have something for them to do every year. This is how they're going to get the money. So you're not cutting the teak corpuses. Every year you're going to keep repeating this approach. But the idea is to remove the teak and conserve the wetlands, which you're clearly not doing. Then I said, okay, so what is the role of these eco-development committees? Do they decide how much teak to cut? I said, no, they don't know how to do all of this. We decide how much teak should be cut. Okay. Then what do? Do they decide when they're going to organize to cut the teak? No, they don't do that also. These are tribal communities. They don't know anything. They're ignorant. We have to tell them what to do. Okay. So obviously we are getting, I'm listening to this and getting a little more horrified about what his idea of eco-development is. So the forest department calls them and tells them that you will cut so many logs of teak here. Said, okay, then what do? Then it's sold on the market and we give them the money. Said, okay, so they sell it on the market. No, they will get exploited in the market if they sell this teak. So the forest department takes the teak and auctions it. I said, then how do the eco-development committee get money? Okay, they give you a plan of what they're going to use this money for, and then you distribute the money. I thought that's at least what the eco-development committee is doing. And he said, no, we know which community needs how much money because we know what their needs are. So we allocate the money. I said, then where is the eco-development and where is the committee? But that was very, very beyond that. So I'm just questioning, when we talked about last episode, the idea of protected areas, that was to me a big awakening point. Like Madhu, you're saying your awakening point was a 5-star hotel in the park. That was for me my big awakening point, saying, in the name of these joint forest management committees, in the name of these eco-development committees, if our ideology is the same and if the apparatus is the same, that determines, the institutions are the same that determine, it's you are extending your largesse to somebody, but you're still maintaining that same way of thinking. That how are you ever going to get to sustainable?
See, I think the point is also, going back to the last episode, we discussed protected areas. In some sense, if you look at it historically, the movement from the protected area sentiment to the emergence of sustainable development is a long path, but it's a short period of time. It's end of the World War II to about the 80s and 90s. And during which time, it's a very busy time for the emergence of the larger global environmental movement, right, on the one side. And the other side is this entire development discourse, which is happening. Post World War II, there's a large decolonisation movement, particularly in Asia and Africa. And lots of new nation states are coming up, and the whole idea of, this the idea of development, which comes from, the kind of Truman Doctrine, which emerges after Truman being the successor president after the World War II of the US, and comes up with the idea of what America can do for the rest of the world. And so, cut a long story short, development emerges as a certain kind of plan within which a whole area of the world which is underdeveloped can come into the realm of developed nations. So a whole bunch of things across agriculture, across industry, across education, across healthcare are defined. So it's a sort of template which is built and rolled out. So that on one side is going on. And that is linked to people's material fortunes, their progress in the world, and it's for the betterment of population. So it is seen as a larger project with the population and the national level. But simultaneously is also this rising in the West, thanks to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, of the whole coming together of the environmental movement. And there's a whole string of it. We have too little time in these kind of episodes to talk about it, but really encourage people to look at this period, particularly in America and Europe and rest of the world. And of course, during this period of time, as in our parts of the world too, various kinds of environmental movements are coming together. Chipko being, if you cast the arc longer, over the 50s, 40s to the 70s, there's a whole set of movements around the world, Latin America included, so there is an environmental sensibility of different kinds that is emerging. And one important thing with Paul Ward and his co-authors in the book called Environment, we talk about the emergence of the idea of an environment itself. So long story short, these two things come together, and I think there are tensions between them. The problem that these all come together in 1972 in the Stockholm Conference, where Indira Gandhi articulates this idea the most eloquently, saying that you're asking us to preserve nature when,
we remove poverty.
We need to remove poverty, right? So I think sustainable development emerges through a complex set of conferences, movements, and also the first time, the important thing to understand, the history of the protectionist movement is very different from this. All this evolves through conferences. It's a very different kind of international network.
World Council of Churches played such an important role, because the whole idea of sustainable development was to bring everybody together.
Correct.
But let's say, 72. I was born in 1972. So many years on, 52 years on from that, where do we think this is going? I mean, let's look at Lakshadweep. What do you think the story there is with sustainable development?
Lakshadweep is part of the exclusive economic zone of India. And to some extent, the exclusive economic zone is the biggest enclosure project that has ever been attempted. After the UN law in the 80s. Okay. And that is it's an audacious attempt at enclosure at a massive scale in the sea. Right? But that enclosure was a very different kind of enclosure project from the biodiversity enclosure project, which is essentially one for the exclusive use of economic resources. And the Lakshadweep plays itself out within that as well, right? And here, the genuine needs of food security become very, very apparent in places like in most coastal communities, where if you think about it, fish are the last wild game that we still hunt and eat. Right?
And we're still allowed to hunt it.
And you're still allowed to hunt it.
Well, it's called fishing, not hunting.
It's called fishing rather than hunting. And so the idea of the fishery is extremely important in the context of food security. And the narrative there is that as long as you understand the dynamics of the fish population itself, you should be able to take things out take a certain amount for your genuine needs of food security without causing the population to decline. And in fact, if you hunt it or you fish it at a particular rate, you can actually maximize the amount of productivity that the system can give you, right? And so these ideas of the maximum sustainable yield, started emerging, which is basically modeled fish populations, which follow some kind of a curve. As you increase effort, you get you have your productivity increasing or certain decreasing, and then you can, again using the model, figure out the exact amount that you can take without the population collapsing.
And this assumes it's not a complex system. There's no other variables going on. Every year you can do this.
Yeah, that there is only one species, that the age structure of the population really well, that you're tracking it in time, that people are going to respect exactly taking that same amount of fish year after year after year. These are concepts that developed in the templates, where often ecosystems are much simpler, etc. You try and apply that to tropical systems where they're, ridiculously complex. You're dealing with...
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the ecological side of the sustainability argument, right? But there is the development side of the sustainable development argument, and which is where I think communities get recruited. So if we went back to the protected area story, then we realized the communities were excluded. And clearly there was a pushback against that. The need for inclusion arises even in the rollout of the development project by the 70s. The communities are the right locus. And I think community conservation, communities allowed to participate. So the kind of eco-development project you were talking about is in some sense the state mandating a certain participation of the local communities in the process of conservation, and hence being called eco-development. And Madhu has experiences from India to talk about, communities and their role in conservation. I think it's been a very contested territory, but it's a forward movement from the protected areas where a new constituent, a stakeholder is being explicitly invoked. And, the idea was to pull them into participation, largely to do with the broader unfolding of the democratic process around the world. So I think that's an interesting emergence. It emerges at the at the intersection of all these.
I think there are a lot of global pressures at that time, as some of which he alluded to. The change from Cold War years and the desire of especially the United States to be the enabler of development in certain areas. The articulation on the other side of someone like Indira Gandhi saying that this is on a global stage, talking about equity and at the level of nation states, and that same idea being made to kneel down to the level of protected area. And one is asking about what of the fate of marginalized people here. So I think there is an enormous amount of pressure to make the conservation project relevant in the broader set of needs and aspirations that people at large have, which the conservation project really doesn't seem to be addressing. So on the one hand, at the global stage, you have the IUCN, which has until then been on the forefront of trying to imagine and enable protected areas. WWF, that's been a supporter of things like the Project Tiger and so on, coming together in and drafting a document called Caring for the Earth, Strategy for Sustainable Living, which is also trying to say, okay, well, we've thought about conservation a certain way, but that idea of conservation can actually be, what we've actually been trying to say all along is that this, conservation is about sustaining the life support system, diversity of life, and so on, while also enabling the well-being of communities and doing so into perpetuity. That is the whole idea of.
There's also the emergence of the triple bottom line, right? Which emerges. Yeah. And sometimes.
And can you have your cake and eat it?
Can you have your cake and eat it too? I think that's very critical.
But I think a large part of, starting from the anecdote that you began with, it's a lot easier to begin with changes in language than to effect changes in behavior. So I think so therefore, I think social forestry came about. Many of these, like you were saying, are like mandated top-down. These are really like not bottom-up processes by which we are trying to find out what is your idea of development that we can support. It is, here is our idea of development, go get developed. So that was largely.
And also, I think the predominance of markets, and I think we've spoken about that, of the role of markets, and fisheries is a really interesting example, where I think the market as representation of the economy, as what represents the economy, is, and particularly when we see it in the case of the tuna and things like that, how when left alone to the market, if market is the only force which represents the economy, how an entire species can get completely fished out, right? And while the purposes of development and the economy are fulfilled, but ecology gets a short shift.
Yeah, the whole thing of if you're catching fish to feed the stomach, there's a certain limit to which you can catch it. Okay, but when it is called upon to fulfill this role of development, which is defined in different ways in the economy as it is to local communities, there is no end there to how much you can actually catch. And if you look at, for instance, fisheries policies in many parts of the world, including India, much of it is dependent on how much fish is out there and how much fish can you therefore sustainably take. And interestingly, the science keeps keeping ahead of what is actually being caught. So fish, potential fish yields, every time it is being evaluated, always keeps ahead of what is actually being caught. At the same time, okay, when you speak to local communities on the ground, they will talk about the decline in fish catches as they're experiencing it. So what local communities experience, okay, and what the science tells us, or the science that is being commissioned by at the national level tells us, is completely at odds with one another.
And that's where, to me, the market comes in. I'm thinking of some work we did in Honduras. So there were protected areas. There's or let's say Guatemala, there's a Selake National Park, and which is a high mountain area, very, very, protected, highly protected, and no roads, no railways. But then coffee comes in. And so the Honduran government and the Guatemalan government are making big push towards coffee, especially Honduras. And then shade grown coffee is extremely economically valuable. So it's like your entire work in Bandipur. And so what they do is, at the same time, it's a protected area, but the government in Honduras itself is saying that we will open up and create roads. If you grow coffee in this mountainous protected area, we will create a road for you to break that coffee out. So for the sake of supposed sustainable development, they're willing to forego the protected area category and create roads. And of course, once roads come, everything else comes. And so these contradictions are very inherent.
Contestation. And I think if we talk about the enclosure project, you have the idea of nature as being inherently valuable, etc., for its own good. When you talk about sustainable development, there is this other idea, other value that's been placed. Really,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The value of
Yeah, I think that's really important to articulate, that the idea that there is different ideas of value that are playing out here, right? And I think that's what one needs to bring to center stage at some time in terms of contestation of ideas. So conservation, actually, if you step back and look at it, is fraught with these contestations. So particularly this idea of debate, and where I think conservation, the science and the natural scientists have not probably fulfilled their role to the extent one would have expected them to do, is to problematize the idea of development itself. And in some sense, in climate science today, I think when we talk about the planetary crisis, I think people are really, the science is really saying that this particular model of the economy is really problematic, right? You can't continue, I think this is a very famous statement by Kenneth Boulding. It said that, infinite growth on a finite planet is either the dreams of a madman or an economist, right? So, there is something that you have to problematize as ecologists, this idea. But the sustainable conservation under the rubric of sustainable development has proceeded on this premise that we can't. And also, it's a project of accommodation. If you look back at the 70s and 80s, there was a genuine threat. The International Conservation Brigade felt that the newly developing countries would actually not support anything to do with conservation. And the development would sweep the way. So part of it was political adjustment.
It was an attempt to be inclusive.
And partly saying that, we'll lose the whole script if we don't get onto this bandwagon of sustainability. It was like a via media. It was a negotiated settlement. But it's full of contradictions, right from its birth. In fact, I think the protected area kind of thing has greater clarity than conservation under the sustainable
development. If you look at the sustainable development goals and their metrics, for instance, one of the metrics is the number of protected areas that you have, which are isolated protected area, isolated from human pressure. Another metric is that every village should have within 5 kilometers of some X distance a hospital. You can't have the two. They're clearly working in opposition. And that's a clear, one of the most obvious examples. There are many others that these are working. But I think the biggest thing for me, if I look back, is that the whole thing was a push by international development agencies and international organizations. And somehow the rest of the world has now got on the bandwagon. Every small organization.
No, I think it's rather than somehow, I think it was quite clear how. There was a huge amount of money pumped.
Absolutely.
So, for instance, in India, the example you were taking of this protected area in North Bengal, and there are like half a dozen others, they all came under a large project called the India Eco Development Project. And it was through a concentrated, input of vast amounts of funds over a short period of time
from
in
the World
specific
Bank
areas,
and Asian Development Bank.
An alternate imagination of what the protected area can. So protected area anyway takes, it needs to be sustained. It takes money. And if you're doing completely hands-off, yes, these were areas where you had game, you had timber, and you had ways of sustaining that. The economic activity sustained the infrastructure, the costs of running this. But if you're going completely hands-off, what is it going to be? So I think it was a lot of these multilateral projects, multilateral funding largely enabled the opening of this protected areas to the idea that they need to engage with constituents outside and So how do you sustain something like this without plugging it to the larger, wider economy? And that is a contrary impulse to the impulse of a protected area, which is to cut off and sequester and not have anything to do with the economy and growth and development. Those you deal with
So,
outside.
I mean, Madhu, those are
was-
the yeah.
There's just one thing, Madhu. So what you're saying is that
No, let me just finish this. So, as a result, so it was completely an opposite impulse to protection.
No, I think
That you
that's
had
a
to-
slippery slope.
That is.
That's
So,
a
but
slippery slope.
but when it did that, the only way you could do this is by plugging into a larger economic machine that is built around generating certain kinds of surpluses through certain kinds of processes. And somewhere you also had to start opening up you started opening up possibilities by which larger economic processes could start coming into places that were once enclosed from precisely these kind of economic processes, or at least the aspiration was to enclose them from.
So I'm wondering whether what you're saying, I haven't thought about much, is that these were production landscapes for the longest possible time. The production landscapes, whether it was on the land or in the sea, and that the conservation movement is really anomalous. It's a bit of an anomaly in this space, and the sustainable development movement comes almost as a counter to the conservation to some extent.
In some sense, you're saying that's a broader narrative that was anyway there.
That was, and that is underlying all of this. And it's basically, countering the preservationist narrative, which comes largely from the West in its modern form. And that pushback from the global South is really about reclaiming these production landscapes for its own. Not the rest of it. And then the question I want to ask is that how then do you maintain the preservationist narrative within the sphere of sustainability? Because it's not as though the preservation has gone away.
I think the question needs to be phrased slightly differently in the sense that both emerge in the modern version of it from the state. The preservationist one as well as the developmental instinct. So they respond to different imperatives of the state. Right? One is this imperative of development, right? And the other is the protectionist narrative, which comes from territorial control and governance of natural resources, which is very deeply incorporated into the colonial idea of the state. And I think that's a continuity which across the world, which inhabits all states. The idea of governing seemed off.
So one is the thing of the state to create something grand, the monument of the idea of the state. But the second is the impulse of the state to respond to its citizens, which is where is your development, right? Where is your poverty?
Sustainable development, in some sense,
is an attempt to marry them.
Marry the two.
But it's also the flirtation with the market as well.
Correct. So now here's the thing, right? So what is happening in the 70s and 80s? It is really important to step back and to look at the global idea. The idea of development itself is shifting. And in the role of development, global markets, private enterprise, finance. So the whole idea of what we today label neoliberal capital is emerging. So what are the goals of development has shifted from the government being a provider of jobs and security of various kinds to letting the market be the determinant of all of it, the arbiter of economic justice. So I think that's the interesting shift that is happening from the 70s on to the 90s and right into now. And when we talk about the latest phase of conservation, in some sense, which emerges in the last 20 to 30 years, I think you're facing
I think
very different set of
what is really interesting for me here is also the role of knowledge in this whole process. How it has, how the science has moved from the preservationist in the preservation space to this
Absolutely.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so you have this whole breed of modelers that come on board. Basically, talk about what is, what are the carrying capacity of these systems? What can we justifiably take from the system, so that we can still maintain them in some kind of form where the conservationists would be happy.
So Forrester's idea taken to the rest of conservation.
To the rest of conservation.
And then all at a time when the purist conservationist is still deeply disturbed by this mission drift that's taking place in conservation, which is clearly about protecting and enclosing areas and protecting them from wildlife, from all
Dumbo comes out as
freeing them of all social obligations. All of a sudden, you're taking on the idea of including people and advancing them economically and affording them development and so on. So there is this one powerful critique that came in the mid-90s that ends the piece by saying that this pursuit of sustainable development is leading us to wave the banner of conservation while presiding over the demise of biodiversity. So, and I think that that was the deep disquiet, that these areas are being now open now. So now, how do you do development without establishing supply chains, without moving commodity across various places, getting people, bringing capital into these landscapes and taking commodity out of these landscapes? How is development going to happen? It was, and the world itself was moving more and more further away from the welfare idea to one that was entirely premised on the injection, much more capitalistic.
But what bothers me now is, I mean, we saw those critical conversations, and we saw the fact that they were actually getting into debates and arguments, and there were fractures. But now, if you look at, for instance, a lot of small conservation organizations across India, and I know definitely in many parts of the global south at least, have uncritically adopted the sustainable development goals. Whenever they write a conservation project and ask for funds, it's saying my project will address sustainable development goals 1.1, 2.3, 4.4, and they will do the following without looking at the inherent contradictions.
Yeah.
And that bothers me. So if I'm to say, let's try and wrap up this episode by asking each of you, because sustainable development is an idea, just like protected areas as an idea has a good and a bad. Sustainable development as an idea was an important idea. An idea to include everybody, an idea to dismantle some power asymmetries, to get people out of poverty, and to see to what extent some of the flaws of the protected area model
Yeah, but
this can't be fixed.
I don't know. To be a little polemical, I would say the sustainable idea is a development idea is a desperate attempt to create, what were those things called? Lion and tiger was tiger and lion will tigon or something like that. It's about creating these new species because you want them to be there, right? It's more a reflection of one's aspiration that you can square the circle, so to speak, that you can bring these very divergent, very contradictory tensions.
People have to live, and
sometimes these things, the tensions have to be reimagined. That it's not so. See,
but what's also interesting when you look at the progression of the protected area, the preservationist impulse and this sustainable development impulse, what they share in common is that the ideation is happening somewhere else,
and the implementation,
and then it's being
thrust upon somebody.
We top down. So there is an entirely different dynamic in terms of institutional and in terms of the process. That there are definitely many other dynamics. Definitely one that could be bottom up. So the ideas are worthy, but the practice is still very institutionally rigid, and having to deal with an enormous amount of legacy and the inertia of legacy.
And for you?
For me, I mean, what really strikes me is the fact that we've always been thinking that we're dealing with a single planetary crisis, but actually we're dealing with three, right? And these three planetary crises are biodiversity loss, climate change, food security. The wickedness of this triad of planetary crises is that actually, in trying to resolve one, you're going to screw up the other, right? And it's very difficult to find solutions that work for all three. So the idea that you're going to have a win-win-win, okay, is a difficult one to pass. And my sense is that the flaw in trying to resolve the wickedness of this is that there is one global solution that we will just magically apply, whether it is a protected area or a sustainable development, that will work everywhere. And more I'm beginning to see that actually those single solutions are unlikely to function. Context is everything, culture is everything, history is everything. And unless we take into account the ecological context, the social context, the historical context, and the cultural context, all to come to bear,
it has to
at scale.
Respect place.
And the place is so important to have to re-establish place as being the fundamental place where you look for solutions. What that might mean, and I think probably this is thinking about the episodes that we talk about later.
But also in closing, I would just say the reason I was saying is that I think one has to work from both ends, from the ecology end and the economy end. Reframe the idea of development and reframe the idea of conservation, right? So this whole idea that it is a universal, and I think both from protected area and development perspective, I think what has haunted these kind of challenges, these wicked problems, is the pursuit of the universe. So,
which is the Western scientific pursuit
Correct.
of ecology itself. And to think of ecology as dissociative place is very ironic. It doesn't make any sense. But I think in the next episode, we'll get into economy, which is an
more big
even
universe.
more universalizing factor. And thank you for joining us. And please stay with us for episode 4, where we discuss the role of the market as a new solution for biodiversity and conservation.